Debbie, it hurts too much, she whispered. The cowboy touched her face. That's how you know you're still. The cowboy had always been a solitary figure roaming the wide open plains that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Desp, his life was simple. Nothing flashy, nothing extraordinary. He woke up before the sun every morning, tended to his horses, checked his fences, and made sure the water troughs were filled. Most people in the small town knew him as the quiet cowboy who kept to himself, never getting involved in town gossip or events. He never stayed in one place too long. The people in the town had long accepted that he was just that way, content with his own company. He wasn't always like this. In his younger years, he had been full of life, always ready for a good laugh and a warm conversation with anyone willing. He had dreams once, big dreams, dreams that involved family, a home, and maybe even a little ranch of his own. But dreams had a way of fading, like dust in the wind. Now he was just a shadow of who he once was, a man who avoided any connection with others. His past was not something he liked to think about, but it lingered in the back of his mind, like a storm cloud he could never shake. He'd had love once, a woman who had made him believe in the possibility of a future, a family, but life had a way of testing such hopes, and when it did, it had broken them both. She was gone now, her absence a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of time could fill. It had taken him a long time to get used to the idea of being alone, and now it was something he had accepted. He lived with it, day by day, never allowing anyone to get too close. People only brought pain, and the cowboy had no intention of opening himself up to it again. But everything changed the day he saw her. He was riding his horse along the dirt path that led through the valley when he first spotted her. She was lying on the ground, barely visible from a distance, her body crumpled in an unnatural way. At first he thought she might be a mirage, the kind of vision the heat plays tricks on your eyes with. But as he drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was a woman, and she was hurt. The cowboy's instincts kicked in. He slowed his horse and dismounted quickly, rushing to her side. She was unconscious, her face pale and streaked with dirt and blood. Her clothes were torn, and she looked like she had been through hell. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he gently touched her arm, feeling for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. Bah! His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area. There was no sign of any attackers or wild animals. It seemed like she had just been left there, abandoned, alone. The cowboy had seen people suffer before, but something about this woman stirred, something deep inside him. Breath. She wasn't just another lost soul on the prairie. There was something different about her, something that made him feel like he couldn't just leave her there. He gathered her in his arms, careful not to jostle her too much as he lifted her onto his horse. He knew he needed to get her to safety, to shelter, and somewhere she could heal. His cabin was the closest place, a small, modest structure tucked away near the edge of the valley. It was isolated, but it was all he had, and it would have to do. The ride back to his cabin felt endless. The cowboy kept one arm around the woman, holding her steady as his horse galloped across the rough terrain. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, casting long shadows across the land. He carefully helped her off the horse and carried her inside, laying her down on the simple cot he used for rest. He covered her with a blanket and started a fire in the hearth, hoping the warmth would help revive her. The cowboy worked quickly, checking her wounds and cleaning them as best as he could with the supplies he had. Her injuries weren't life-threatening, but she had clearly been through something traumatic. The woman's face remained lifeless, her breathing shallow, and the cowboy found himself looking at her with concern. He wasn't used to caring for someone this way, especially not someone who was a stranger. But as he worked, something inside him stirred, a feeling he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was something more. He didn't know, but he couldn't deny that he felt a responsibility to her now. Hours passed before she finally stirred. The cowboy was sitting in the chair beside her, watching the fire crackle as it cast dancing shadows on the walls. He heard a soft gasp and looked up to see her eyes flutter open. She blinked several times as though trying to focus, and when her gaze finally landed on him, she winced. "It hurts too much," she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. The cowboy felt a pang in his chest, the kind of feeling that made him want to reach out and offer comfort, but he didn't know how. He had never been good at showing his emotions. It was easier for him to shut them down, to keep them locked away where they couldn't hurt him. He hesitated for a moment before standing up and walking over to her side. He gently touched her face, his rough hand contrasting with the softness of her skin. His touch was tentative, unsure, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, as if savoring the warmth of the gesture. "That's how you know you're still alive," he said softly, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. "The pain reminds you that you're still here, you're still fighting." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she just stared at him with those wide, tired eyes, as if trying to understand what he meant. The cowboy wasn't sure himself. He didn't usually say such things, especially not to a stranger. But something about her, something about the way she looked at him, made him feel like he had to say it. The woman let out a shaky breath and nodded slowly. I don't know what happened," she murmured. "I was just running." "I couldn't stop." The cowboy listened, but he didn't speak. He wasn't sure if she wanted to talk about it, and he wasn't the type to press. He had learned long ago that some things were better left unsaid. She shifted slightly, her eyes closing again as she let herself rest. The cowboy stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the vast, empty landscape. The sun had fully set now, and the stars were beginning to twinkle in the dark sky. For a moment, he wondered if he had made the right choice in bringing her here. Desperate. He had no idea who she was or what kind of life she had led. But something told him that, just like him, she had been broken by the world. But maybe, just maybe, they could heal together. He returned to the fire, sitting silently in the chair, watching the woman sleep. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what kind of future he could offer her. But for now he knew one thing. She was safe here, in his home, far from whatever nightmare she had been running from. The next morning, the sun filtered through the small cabin window, casting a soft golden light across the room. The fire from the night before had burned out, leaving only the remnants of warmth lingering in the air. The cowboy had slept lightly in the chair beside her, waking often to check that she was still breathing, that she was still there. His mind hadn't rested, turning over thoughts of his past and his choices, as they always did when he was left alone with his thoughts. But now, in the quiet, he focused on the woman lying in his bed. When she woke, her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the daylight. She looked around, disoriented at first, before her gaze fell on him. The cowboy could see the confusion in her eyes, the questions swirling there. She seemed to remember where she was. And then, just as softly as before, she whispered, "It hurts too much." The cowboy felt a rush of sympathy, the kind of feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. He wasn't sure why he was so moved by her words, but something about the vulnerability in her voice made his chest tighten. He didn't say anything right away, letting her speak her truth, her pain, without interruption. She had been through something that left its marks on her. Not just physically, but in ways he couldn't even imagine. Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "You're at my place," the cowboy answered gently, pulling the chair closer to her bedside. I found you in the valley. You were hurt. The woman's eyes flickered with recognition, but there was still a veil of uncertainty over her face. I don't remember much. I remember running. Respect. And then everything went dark. The cowboy could tell she was struggling to piece together the fragments of her memory. He leaned forward slightly, trying to offer reassurance without overstepping. You're safe now. Just rest. We'll get through this together. Her eyes searched his face, as though trying to read him.
The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable.
It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a wordless understanding of shared pain. She wasn't alone in her suffering. The cowboy knew that all too well. I'm sorry, she said after a pause, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to burden you. He shook his head. You're not a burden. I just don't want you to be alone in this. The woman blinked, her brow furrowing. What happened to you? Why are you out here? All alone. He wasn't one to talk about himself. He had spent years perfecting the art of keeping his past buried deep, locked away where no one could reach it. But something about her, about this moment, felt different. She wasn't just another stranger passing through his life. There was something about her that made him feel like he could trust her, even if just for a moment. He sat back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, desperation. I've been through some things, he said simply, his voice low. I used to think I needed people, but... Breath. Over time, I realized I didn't. I thought I could survive alone. I thought it would be easier. She turned her head toward him, her eyes soft. But it's not easier, is it?
He smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth she had just spoken. No.
Bros. It's never easier, but it's safer. Or at least, I thought it was. The woman shifted in the bed, wincing slightly as she did. The cowboy quickly got to his feet and went to fetch a bowl of water. He handed it to her gently, watching her take a sip, her hands trembling just a little. He couldn't help but notice how fragile she seemed, and it made something stir in him, something protective, something he thought he had lost long ago. As she drank, she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the coolness of the water against her dry throat. When she lowered the bowl, she spoke again. I never thought I'd end up here. I was just... trying to get away. I thought I could outrun it. Whatever it was that chased me, but it caught up. The cowboy didn't interrupt, letting her tell her story at her own pace. It was clear she was holding something back, her words measured and careful. But even without her saying it outright, he could feel the weight of her pain. The loss, the betrayal, the fear of being hunted. The cowboy knew a thing or two about running from the past, about hiding in plain sight. He wasn't going to push her. He had learned long ago that people shared only what they wanted to.
Do you want to talk about it? He asked softly, his voice kind but firm, offering her the space if she needed it.
She shook her head slightly, her eyes cast downward.
Not yet, she replied.
Maybe, not ever. The cowboy nodded in understanding. That's fine.
Rasp. You don't have to talk if you're not ready.
They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The cowboy could see the struggle on her face, the effort it took to keep the pieces of herself together.
He could relate to that. He knew what it was like to feel like you were falling apart and to try and hide it from everyone around you. Bert, I just want to go home, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But I don't know where home is anymore. But he didn't know the specifics of her story. But he could sense the deep sense of loss she carried with her. It was the same feeling he had carried for years, though he had never been able to admit it. He had told himself that being alone was better. He had convinced himself that it was easier to be distant, to not get attached. But in this moment, with this woman, he realized how wrong he had been. Being alone wasn't easier. It was just lonelier.
You're safe here, the cowboy said, breaking the silence.
You can stay as long as you need. I'm not going anywhere.
Her gaze softened at his words, and for a moment she seemed to relax, her body sinking into the bed. The cowboy could tell she didn't believe him entirely, but it was a start. Trust was a fragile thing, something that took time to build. But the cowboy wasn't in a rush. He knew that the healing process wasn't quick. It took time, patience, and sometimes just a little bit of kindness.
I don't know what you see in me,
She murmured, her voice almost drowned by the sound of the wind outside.
I don't know why you're helping me.
The cowboy stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the vast wilderness that stretched before him. Breaths. The wind was picking up, swirling dust in the distance. It was a reminder of how small and insignificant they both were in the grand scheme of things, how fleeting everything seemed. And yet, in this small cabin, in this quiet moment, there was something that felt right, something that felt like it could last.
I don't know why either,
he said quietly, his gaze lingering on the horizon. Maybe I just know what it's like to feel like you don't belong. Or maybe I see someone who's trying to find their way, just like I am. She didn't say anything at first, but after a moment she nodded. Her eyes met his, and there was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding, a recognition of each other's pain. The cowboy turned back to face her, his expression softening.
We all need a little help sometimes,
he said. Yes, even if we don't always know how to ask for it. She smiled faintly, her lips curving upward just enough to show that she appreciated the gesture. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough. Enough to show that she wasn't beyond saving. And for the cowboy, that was enough. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next, as the cowboy and the woman settled into a quiet routine at the cabin.
It wasn't much, a small cabin with a fireplace, a few chairs, and a bed, but it was enough for now.
For the first time in a long while, the cowboy didn't feel the weight of his loneliness as heavily. Her presence, even in her silence, was a kind of comfort he hadn't realized he needed. The woman, whose name the cowboy still didn't know, had grown stronger each day. She spent most of her time resting, but she also helped him with the small tasks around the cabin. She'd gather firewood when the weather was mild, and when the wind howled outside, she'd sit by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance in the hearth. The cowboy had noticed that sometimes she would stare into the flames as if lost in thought, her eyes distant, her mind far away. One afternoon, as they sat together near the fire, the woman spoke for the first time about the life she had been running from. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if she was testing the waters to see if it was safe to reveal the truth.
I used to have a family, she said, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes cast at
breath. He glances around and distressed. I had a mother and father, 2 brothers. We lived on a small farm.
I was happy there. Or, at least, I thought I was.
The cowboy said nothing, just listened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the sadness, that she hadn't yet been able to let go of. He didn't interrupt. He wasn't sure if she wanted him to say anything or just to listen, but he had learned long ago that silence often spoke more than words.
I don't know what happened, she continued. One day they were there, and the next day...
They were gone. Just gone. No warning. No reason. I searched for them for months. Bert, I thought maybe they had just left me behind. But then I found out.
I found out they had been taken.
Her voice broke on the last word, and she fell silent. The spouse could see the tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, not wanting to show weakness.
I don't know who did it, she went on, her voice shaking.
But I know they weren't the only ones. There were others, too. People taken. People who just disappeared without a trace. The cowboy could feel the weight of her story, the depth of her pain. He had his own scars, but they were nothing like what she had endured. Her loss wasn't just a matter of death. It was a violation of everything she had once known, a destruction of her world. It was no wonder she had run. He understood that feeling all too well.
They left me with nothing.
I had to learn how to survive on my own, with no one to trust, no one to help me. I had to keep moving, always moving.
I thought I could outrun the memories, outrun the fear, but it doesn't work that way.
The cowboy shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly. It never does, he said quietly. You can run, but it always catches up to you. It catches up to all of us. The woman glanced at him then, her eyes narrowing, as if she were trying to read him. He didn't mind. It was only fair that she see the truth in him, too. They were both running in different ways, but they were running all the same. What about you? She asked. Why do you live out here?
What happened to you?
The cowboy took a deep breath, staring into the fire for a long moment. He wasn't sure if he was ready to talk about it, but he knew she deserved at least some answer. She had shared her pain with him, and it was only right to do the same.
I was a soldier once, he said slowly, his voice steady.
Brains. I fought in a war, far from here. I saw things I can't forget. When it was over, I came home, but home wasn't the same anymore. People change when they go to war, and sometimes they don't come back the same. He stopped himself there, unwilling to go any deeper into the story. He wasn't ready to reveal everything. Not yet. There were pieces of his past he had locked away, and he wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to open that door again. But even just speaking those words, admitting that much, felt like a small release. The woman didn't press him for more details. She seemed to understand, as if she knew that sometimes words weren't enough to explain the things that shaped a person. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. Neither of them was in a hurry to break the quiet. There was something comforting in it, something that felt safe, in a way nothing else ever had. Later that day, as the cowboy worked on mending a fence near the cabin, the woman came outside to help.
She had grown restless, and the fresh air seemed to do her good. Together, they worked in silence, repairing the broken wood, fixing the post that had been leaning.
There was no rush, no need to finish quickly.
It wasn't about the task. It was about the time spent together, side by side.
The cowboy glanced over at her as she worked, her hair tied back, her face flushed with the effort. She wasn't the same woman who had stumbled into his life days ago. Breath. She was stronger now, more present. She had come a long way from the broken, silent figure she had been. It wasn't much, but it was progress. And in a life like his, progress was worth holding on to. Narration. When they finished, they sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun dip low on the horizon. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, the world around them growing quiet as night began to fall. The air had cooled, and the wind had calmed. It was a peaceful evening, one that felt like it might last forever. "You're getting better at this," the cowboy said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. She laughed softly, a sound that was rare but welcomed. "I've had a lot of practice," she said, her voice light. "Survival has a way of teaching you things you didn't think you'd ever need to know." Rasket. Yeah. It does that. They sat there, looking out over the land, and for the first time in a long time, the cowboy didn't feel the weight of his past as heavily. It wasn't gone, of course, but he didn't expect it ever to be.
But do you feel as suffocating anymore?
And for her, the woman who had come to him in the middle of her own storm, maybe the world wasn't so bleak after all. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. As the night settled in and the stars began to emerge one by one, the cowboy stood and stretched, ready to call it a day.
He turned to the woman who was still sitting on the porch, her eyes fixed on the sky.
"You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her expression softening. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something, but instead, she just nodded. She whispered, almost to herself. "I'm not." The days were passing quicker now. The air had begun to shift toward the chill of autumn, and the leaves of the trees around the cabin had started to turn colors, turning the world into a palette of warm reds, oranges, and yellows. The cowboy and the woman had settled into a rhythm, their days spent working together to prepare for the colder months. The mornings were spent gathering firewood, checking the fences, and repairing small parts of the cabin that needed attention. In the afternoons, they would sit by the fire, and sometimes they would talk, while other times the silence between them felt comfortable, familiar, and unspoken. The cowboy had grown to appreciate the quiet. It was rare for him to allow anyone into his life. But with her, it was different.
There was no pressure to be anything other than what they were. Two people who had found themselves in unexpected circumstances and were simply doing what they could to survive.
Desperation. He found solace in knowing that she was healing, slowly but surely. Her body was no longer fragile, and though the emotional scars ran deeper than he could see, he knew she was starting to trust him more. Each day she stayed was a quiet affirmation that she was beginning to let go of the fear that had once controlled her life. But there was something else, a quiet tension that had been building ever since they had arrived at the cabin. The cowboy didn't know if it was just the weight of their shared pasts, the bond that had formed from mutual understanding, or something more. He didn't want to name it, not yet. But he could feel it, like a thread running between them, unspoken, but always there. Ray. One evening after a long day of work, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the plains. The sky was painted with hues of gold and purple, the light softening the world around them. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the arms of the old wooden seat, while the woman sat across from him, her eyes distant as she gazed at the horizon. It had become a familiar sight, the two of them sitting there in silence, enjoying the peaceful solitude of the land.
She was the first to break the quiet, her voice soft, almost hesitant.
"Do you ever wonder if we're running from something we can't outrun?"
Her words caught him off guard, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to respond. He thought about it for a moment,
All the time, he replied finally. I think about it more than I'd like to admit. He paused, taking a deep breath.
We all have things we can't run from. The past has a way of following you, no matter how far you go. But it doesn't have to define you.
A woman nodded slowly, as if weighing his words.
Psh. She had come a long way from the broken figure who had arrived on his doorstep days ago. There was a strength in her now, one that was beginning to show itself in the way she held herself, in the way she looked at the world around her. It was a quiet strength, born not from fighting, but from surviving, from learning how to live despite the hurt. She turned her gaze back to the horizon. Psst. I don't know if I'm ready to face it, she said quietly. What happened? What I ran from? I don't know if I can go back and confront it.
The cowboy understood.
He had spent years avoiding his own past, running from the things that hurt the most. He didn't have the answers for her, didn't know how to ease the burden she carried. But he did know one thing. You don't have to face it alone, he said softly. You've got more strength in you than you think. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together. She looked at him then, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. For a moment he saw something in them. A flicker of trust, a flicker of something deeper. Something that made his heart beat just a little faster, though he couldn't name it. The moment passed, and she looked away again, her gaze drifting back to the sunset. Maybe, she said quietly, maybe I'm not running anymore. Maybe I'm just waiting for something to change. The cowboy didn't answer right away. Brett. Instead, he leaned forward in his chair, his fingers tightening slightly on the wooden arms. Sometimes waiting is the hardest part, he said, his voice thoughtful. But it doesn't mean you're stuck. It just means you're figuring things out. It's all part of healing. She didn't respond right away, but he saw the slight shift in her posture, breaths. She seemed to relax a little, as though she had been holding herself up for so long, trying to keep it all together, and his words had given her permission to let some of it go. For a while they sat there in silence, just watching the world around them shift with the changing light. The stars were beginning to appear, faint and distant at first, but as the darkness grew, they became brighter, more numerous. The cowboy had always found a kind of peace in the night sky. It was a constant, something that hadn't changed no matter what had happened in his life. The same stars he had looked at as a young man. The same stars he had looked at when he was far away from home. Alone in the world. They were a reminder that no matter how far you went, no matter what happened, the world kept turning. As the night deepened, the temperature began to drop, and the cowboy stood, stretching his stiff muscles. It's getting cold, he said, glancing over at the woman. We should head inside. She stood as well, a small smile tugging at her lips. Yeah, I suppose you're right. They went inside, and the cowboy stoked the fire, the crackling of the flames the only sound between them. The woman sat down near the hearth, her eyes following the movement of the fire. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the way the flames danced and flickered, casting shadows on the walls. The cowboy watched her for a moment, noting how she seemed to relax by the fire. Breaths. She was still a long way from being the person she once was, but she was no longer the woman who had arrived, broken and afraid. She was healing, and that was something worth holding on to. Dapson. After a while, he turned to her. You're safe here, he said softly. And when you're ready, whenever that is, you can tell me what happened. We'll deal with it together. Ration. She looked up at him then, and for the first time she truly smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The cowboy didn't need to say anything more. He simply nodded, understanding that her gratitude was enough for now. They both had their own scars, their own battles to fight. But in this small cabin, with the warmth of the fire between them, they didn't have to fight alone. As the night wore on, the woman eventually fell asleep by the fire, her breathing steady and deep. The cowboy watched her for a moment, making sure she was comfortable before retreating to his own corner of the cabin. But even as he lay down on his cot, his eyes on the ceiling, his mind wandered. He had spent so long hiding from his own pain, so long running away from what hurt. And yet here she was, someone who had gone through so much more, who had found a way to keep moving forward, even when everything seemed lost. He thought about what she had said earlier, that maybe she wasn't running anymore.
Maybe, just maybe, they were both done running.
Perhaps they had found something worth staying for. With that thought in his mind, he finally closed his eyes, the quiet of the cabin settling around him. Past. Wasn't gone, not yet. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they might be able to face it. Together. The days had settled into a peaceful rhythm, and with each passing one, the cowboy and the woman grew more comfortable in each other's presence. The cabin was no longer just a place for them to stay. It had become a home, a refuge from the world outside. The fire crackled steadily in the hearth, the wood smell of the cabin mixing with the cool, crisp air that swept in from the open window. There was a quiet calm that enveloped everything. No rush, no pressure, bile. Just the slow passage of time. It had been weeks since the woman had arrived, and in those weeks something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the work they did together around the cabin or the shared meals, but something deeper, a growing understanding. The cowboy had always kept his distance from people, but he had started to notice things about her. Small things, like how her eyes would light up when she spoke of the sunsets, or how she hummed quietly to herself when she thought no one was listening. She had begun to trust him in ways that were still hard for her to fully understand. For the first time, she wasn't running. It felt like she had found a place to pause, a place where the world could slow down and allow her to breathe again. The weight of her past still hung over her, but it no longer seemed so overwhelming. She wasn't defined by her past anymore. Here, with the cowboy, she was someone new, someone stronger, someone with the chance to heal. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, the cowboy and the woman sat on the porch together as they had so many times before. The sky above them was painted with vibrant shades of orange and purple, the colors reflecting off the land in a peaceful glow. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves on the trees and carrying the scent of the earth. It was a perfect evening, one of those rare moments when everything felt right. "You ever wonder if we're meant to be in one place?" the woman asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the evening breeze. She was staring out at the horizon, her mind clearly elsewhere.
Or if we're just passing through, the cowboy glanced at her, unsure of what she meant. Passing through where? She shrugged, her expression distant.
Life. People. Places. Everything. Sometimes it feels like I'm just passing through, like I'm not meant to stay anywhere for long. Like no place is ever really mine. The cowboy didn't answer right away. He knew what she meant, at least a little. They had spent much of his life trying to keep moving, always keeping a distance from people, from places. He had convinced himself that if he didn't stay, if he didn't get attached, then nothing could hurt him. But it wasn't working. The loneliness still crept in. The emptiness still lingered. "I don't know about being meant to be in one place," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. I think sometimes you find something worth staying for. But it doesn't always feel like that right away. She turned to him then, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand what he meant. There was a silence between them, a quiet moment that seemed to stretch forever. And in that silence, the cowboy realized something important. He had spent so much of his life hiding from the pain of his past, convincing himself that it was easier to be alone, that it was safer. But now, with her sitting next to him, with her trust in him, he realized he wasn't running anymore either. Maybe he never really had to run. Maybe there was something more to life than just surviving. Do you think we could have a life here? She asked, her voice a little more tentative now. I mean, you and me together, I guess? The cowboy felt the question settle in his chest, heavy and real. He had never allowed himself to think about a future beyond the cabin. He had always believed that the past was too big a shadow to escape, too strong to outrun. But her words, they made him stop and think. What if this was something worth staying for? What if they could build something together? A life that wasn't about running or hiding or simply existing.
I don't know, he replied, his voice quiet but firm.
But I think we could try. But
It wasn't a promise, but it was something. It was more than either of them had allowed themselves to believe in a long time.
the thought of a future wasn't a burden anymore. It was a possibility, a hope. Later that evening, after the sun had set and the stars had begun to appear, the cowboy sat by the fire, his mind still on their conversation. He couldn't remember the last time he had thought about tomorrow. Every day had felt the same, just a blur of tasks and duties and distractions. But now, for the first time in a long while, he felt like tomorrow could be different. He didn't know what it would look like yet, but it was something to look forward to. The woman had fallen asleep on the couch by the fire, her head resting on a pillow, her body curled up in the way people do when they feel safe. He glanced at her, his heart swelling with something he couldn't name. It was more than gratitude, more than kindness. It was something deeper, a feeling of connection that ran through his bones. She was no longer the frightened woman who had stumbled into his life, uncertain of who she was or where she was going. She had become someone who was starting to believe again, someone who could see a future ahead of her. And maybe, just maybe, they could build that future together. As the fire burned low, the cowboy stood up and gently covered her with a blanket. He sat in his chair again, his eyes lingering on her peaceful face. There was a stillness in the cabin now, a quiet comfort that he hadn't known in years. He had spent so much of his life thinking that peace meant being alone, but now he knew the truth. Peace was being with someone who understood you, someone who had shared the same silence, the same scars, the same pain. Tomorrow would come, and with it whatever future they could make. It wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't matter. It was about learning to live with it, about finding strength in each other and in the life they had built together. It was about not being afraid to look ahead. The cowboy sat there, watching the embers fade, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel like he was running from anything. He was just living. And maybe that was enough.